Hello everyone and welcome back to another automation guide. Today we are doing the American 1980s, and this is a particularly high-tech one because this is the one where at least America gets pretty high-tech because as technology gets smaller, it gets implemented more in cars, as you can see with TBI, throttle body injection, which is electronic fuel injection, and I'll tell you here in a minute once we get to there. All right, first thing starting with the bodies, as everyone knows, the 80s was notorious for being bricks, blocks, etc., especially in the early to mids. Late 80s, they tried to get away from that, but it was like a block around block, if anything. So it's like something like these would be good. Something like that would be good. Well, no, that's actually a supercar more than anything. Let's see here, something like that. That's like my favorite one to use. These would be good. You know, just keep it blocky. That's one thing I can say. Like 70s was square, 80s was blocky. Now onto this panel material: steel, good old American steel. Chassis type: monocoque or unibody. As now every manufacturer has gone to monocoque or unibody in their just regular car since like the very late 70s or very early 80s. Switching from ladder to unibody, monocoque, as it's just lighter, it's more safer, and manufacturing processes has caught up to it as well. Because you can just make a, because technology is actually there to where you can make unibody cars in mass production like America does, instead of like mass production like Europe or Japan does. They make a lot less cars so they can go unibody earlier. Ladder is actually still in use though. Like, what were the bodies? Ladder is dead is now used by fleet cars like the Ford Panther body, Chrysler M platform, and GMB platform. Yeah, like the Ford Panther body, the Crown Victoria, Chrysler M platform, like the Dodge Diplomat, and GMB platform, like the Chevy Caprice, and the 80s. And now chassis material, it actually used galvanized steel now in the 80s. Sometime in the 80s, they switched to full galvanized steel. It wasn't just some sort of anti-corrosion method like in the 70s. It was actual galvanized steel, so start using that. Engine placement, it could be transverse or longitudinal, because, what was it? GM, they started to use transverse in like everything. The only thing they didn't use it was like the Chevy Capri Classic. Capri, whatever. And that was like the only time they used longitudinal. And then Dodge, of course, or Chrysler Corporation had the K platform, the very well known cookie cutter kind of but iconic platform as a transverse. Ford really didn't have one. They actually still had longitudinal. If it was like a Ford of Europe design. If it was transverse, because the Fox body was a longitudinal. And with this design, of course, you could see it's longitudinal, went with the kind of Ford's way. So, transverse or longitudinal, whichever you want. Front suspension. The double McPherson strut on unibody has replaced the double wishbone because it's a lot cheaper to manufacture, a lot simpler to make, and it makes just about the same amount of comfort or so because it's independent. And from what I've researched, not a single car used double wishbone. Not even like unibody car, I should say. Not even like the big cars, like a Cadillac or something, had double wishbone. It was all McPherson strut, like every single one. And then, and then of course, rear suspension. It was actually starting to go over to coils, like the Panther body and the GMB platform. It started to have coils. Chrysler, as I mentioned earlier, was the only one that still used leaves on their M platform. Yeah, the Chrysler M platform. That was like the only one that used leaves. And if it was like a transverse, it would actually have like a McPherson strut front and a torsion beam rear, or that is a shoot, what was it called again? Independent torsion suspension. Yeah, that's what it was. As a semi-independent torsion suspension in the rear. That's what it was. Semi-independent. No semi-trailing arms yet. No double wishbones. No. No, not yet. Not yet. The GM H platform, independent with rear air. I forgot what suspension that was. It's actually been a while since I researched that. It might have been semi-trailing arm with air suspension because of how it works. Semi-trailing arms, fully independent. Torsion beams, a semi-independent. Because if I could switch to it... Well, no, actually I can't. Because that's a glitch. Pretty sure. It's rear-wheel drive, and I could switch to torsion beam. I think that's a glitch. That's funny. Hey, I found something. Oh, okay. Enough of that. Anyways, onto here. If I can... Oh, crap. What the fuck? I'm sorry for that. I'm just gonna continue on. That's funny. That's 2 goofs I found. Oh my gosh. I was not ready. Okay. Engine blocks, inline 4s, of course. Leftover i6s. They were actually kind of dying out now because of, well, if it was longitudinal, you could put it in there, but there wasn't really many longitudinal. Because if it was a longitudinal, it would be a V8 instead. So inline 6s just kind of weren't, because as I said, they were replaced by V6s, if anything. And then V8s are still front longitudinal. So keep it inline 4 and V6s. And of course, the displacement for inline 4, 1.6 to 2.5 liter, V6 2.5 to 3.8 liters, V8s 4 to 5.7 liters. And of course, inline 6s that are holding over are probably still around the same. Of course, block material, cast iron and cast iron block and heads. But for a block, Cadillac HT used an aluminum block, and aluminum heads were for performance. But as you can see, GM 122 and Chrysler K engine had aluminum heads. That's not the Iron. If you're wondering, that's not the Iron Duke. Iron Duke's 153 cubic inch or 2.5 liters. That is a different engine made by, I think, Opel. But yeah, they had, and the Chrysler K engine, that was Chrysler's own engine. It wasn't the Mitsubishi 2.6. That was Chrysler's own K engine that had aluminum head. So if you had an inline 4, I'd say go ahead and put a maybe aluminum head on it. It wasn't as widespread though as it was like in the 90s. It was still cast iron. So just keep that in mind. Let's see here. If it was anything, it'd probably be aluminum heavy. If you're rolling with an aluminum block, it'd probably be aluminum heavy because what was it? Aluminum heavy was like a closed. They explain it in like an update. I'd say just watch the automation video to explain what an aluminum heavy and light is, because it's like something like a closed and an open block. And I forgot which one was which, honestly. New engines were either over square by at least 3 mil or under square by 1 mil, and American companies started to use metric for some measurements. Yes. It was actually in the 70s where America tried to convert to the metric system, and it failed. But then in the 80s, sometime businesses started to use metric because of how they communicate with each other across seas, so they just started to use metric. So engines, of course, to use metrics like this one. Let's see here. And there was another thing. Heads and valves. All American engines, all new engines produced in America are still used overhead valve for all engines. Exceptions were if it was a Japanese engine they used. Yeah. Basically, yeah. Because even the V6s that were being used were still push rods that were either like ages old, like a GM Fireball V6, or based off a V8 that has an overhead valve, or even in inline 4s, they were still overhead valves, like no, the Ford Pinto's overhead cam. The Iron Duke's overhead valve. Yeah. Basically, America still used overhead valve, even in the 80s, which is funny. Of course, cast iron, and what was it? It was in the mid 80s, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, hypertectic started to be used in the mid 80s. So like by 84, it was like 84, 3 or 84 was the earliest it was actually used. So hypertectic was starting to be used instead of regular cast, of course. Tuning here, it depends on what you have. If you have a carburetor, you still don't tune it much. But if you had like a throttle body or multi-point fuel injection, that is where you would actually tune it, because they gave modest horsepower, because you could actually get horsepower with that fuel injection. Throttle body and carburetor kind of had the same horsepower. But throttle body, of course, had better fuel economy. And then if it was multi-point fuel injection, it would have a lot more horsepower than like the carburetor or throttle body counterpart. I'd say at least like 20, 30 more. 20 at the least more. 30 at the max for sure. Let's see here. What was it? Oh, yeah. Yeah, just make the engine efficiency above like 12%. I got 17 out of this one, which is like really good, so just don't poop it, you know. Give me 1 second. Okay, so yeah. The use of 2-barrel on inline 4 and inline 6s, and even V6s, actually, replaces 1 barrel. Because actually, that little idea of what I said, if it was like a V-bank to get 2 carburetors, it would still get a 2-barrel carburetor. Because when V6s came around, they would get a 2-barrel carburetor instead of just like a single barrel like an inline would. So it would get 2-barrel, and especially like I said in the 80s, like an inline 4 or an inline 6 or V6, it would get a 2-barrel carburetor. Like finally, because Japanese engines and European engines actually already used 2-barrel carbs on their inlines, so American engines just went ahead and did that. Let's see here. Standard V8 get 2 and 4-barrel. And throttle body injection is used as early as 1983 by Ford, and MEFI multi-point fuel injection as early as 85 by Pontiac, and not just their Pontiac like performance engines, like a regular Pontiac, like a Bonneville. I think a Bonneville was in the 80s. I have to, maybe not, but yeah, throttle body or single point. Well, 83 is probably that, and multi-point early is 85. Multi-point was actually used a lot earlier in other countries. You shouldn't focus on those, but yeah. Injection starting in the early 80s, throttle body was starting to be de facto on some big engines like the GM Iron Duke, and Ford, of course, again, on mid-80s saw use of the multi-point fuel injection. Yeah. That's actually another funny thing. Single point was replacing carburetors by the mid 80s, and then by the late 80s, multi point was replacing single point fuel injection. It was pretty funny. It was really fast too. Like I'd like doing research on like catalog. What was it? Automobile catalog. It replaced it that quick as soon as they got fuel injection because of CAFE standards and whatnot. And yeah. Manifold standard low, no. Standard mid, yes. Performance, making a comeback on fuel injection, yes. But keep in mind, we're not making muscle cars here. 86, aka unleaded only by now, as gas stations actually still sold leaded fuel in sometime in the 80s, as now cars were completely switched to 86 unleaded. And then, of course, like I said, in 1988, saw GM use premium gasoline in their muscle cars, according to fuelecon.gov. According to them, because it was like, because it would tell you if it runs on regular or premium, and it was like a Camaro or Corvette. It said it used premium, so it's like I still wouldn't use premium. Fuel injection, of course, Headers, no compact cast. Just cast low or mid. Of course, now de facto, tubular was still being used on performance, if you could. And the catalytic converter, the three-way catalytic converter, very quickly replaced the two-way in 81. So from like 75 to 80, it used two-way, and in 81, and even to this day, it uses, well, a three-way catalytic converter. It's actually a lot more complicated than just a regular three-way, because there's like a pre-cat and then the cat and the O2 sensors, but it's basically still uses some sort of form of three-way catalytic converter to this day. Of course, yes, first and second muffler. And that's probably about it. With these, convertibles were actually kind of dying out in the 80s because of safety standards. They were still there. They were just weren't on like the big cars. They were kind of on small compacts. These were still around, vans, SUVs, yeah. Of course, on to the fixtures. Well, of course, as you could see, square headlights. That was very big. And it was very awkward to get the square headlights to look too, which was funny. That was embarrassing. Because every car used square headlights, even if it was like aero was in the way, like this, it still used square headlights. It wasn't until like 86 with the Ford Taurus that it actually had smooth headlights, because of, I think, how the sealed headlights laws were in the rule or something like that, regulations. It was very weird, but just keep that in mind. It was like that until the late 80s, where it actually kind of glossed over them. These like sort of half bumper protectors, amber lights, I'm pretty sure were still a thing. Trims, but yeah, this it was actually very square, very basic in the 80s. Didn't become around until like the late 80s, if anything. Of course. Now, of course, on to here. FR still had our rear-wheel drive. FF had front-wheel drive. One of the few all-wheel drives was the MC Eagle, but it was more of a four-wheel drive than anything because of how you could turn it on and off. Because I'm pretty sure it was a four-wheel drive other than all-wheel drive, but it acted like one. It was weird. I had research on that, and it was very weird. If it was, yeah, basically front-wheel drive, transverse, rear-wheel drive, longitudinal. No four-wheel drive yet or anything. 4-speed manual is now de facto, and even an option. 3-speed manual is rare. I actually wouldn't use 3-speed manuals at all in the 80s. Like I said, rare option in the early 80s. It was like the only car I saw was like a Monte Carlo that used a 3-speed manual. 3-speed automatic was becoming standard over the manual. 4-speed autos were on high-end cars, like a Lincoln. Like beginning in 1980, actually, there was a 4-speed auto. And then they kind of started getting them in the late 80s. They still had like 3 speeds, but 4 speeds were still in the 80s. And then advanced automatic was the norm starting in the early mid 80s. And the difference between a regular automatic and advanced automatic is that an advanced automatic has a locking thing. It actually, it actually has it right here. It has a torque converter. The torque converter can be locked for better economy as combined with use of 5 or more ratios. It was 4 or more, actually, it could be used. Not with 5 or more, 4 or more. That's why they started to use locking differentials. Or not differentials. Locking torque converters in the 80s. Because 4 speeds or more could be locked and have fuel economy. And the gearing setup for this was actually a little weird. I will say gears didn't go above 3 and didn't go below 3, so let's do that. Didn't go above 3.8, didn't go below 3. And gear spacing is weird from 3 to 4 gears. Yeah, every manufacturer had a different thing. So just, I'd say look that up more than anything. That was very weird of how they were. I couldn't describe it. It was like some were short, some were long, some were close, some were spread apart. This one's kind of modest. Like I said, just look it up on Automobile Catalog to see what they did, because that's still a good rule of thumb to do. Because if you don't know how to tune a gearing setup, either use the basic mode or just kind of do it here on your own. Radials. Radials were actually starting to be widespread used, which is great because now, well, tires could just stand a lot longer, and you could use modern tire sizes now, which is good because instead of using like some sort of conversion thing, you can just look up a regular modern tire size. 80 size walls was the biggest found in luxury cars and utility. 60 was the lowest used on performance cars. So yeah, and like I said, use a realistic tire, and of course this is the middle, so he uses like a 70 sidewall. And then compared to nowadays cars, it's like 55 sidewalls. It's like 70 sidewalls now. It's like my truck, I think, has a 70 sidewall, so that's huge. But modern tires are still a lot different than 80s tires, but the sizes were somewhat the same. Of course, steel was still used. I think alloy might have been now an option, but not a widespread option, if anything. Brakes, front venteds replaced just regular solids. So now you could actually, of course, brake a lot better. Rear brakes were still drums, and of course you could still get the option to have four-wheel discs, but if it was an option, it was solid discs instead of four-wheel venteds. Muscle cars still had venteds if it was an option, but not much. Aero, not much. Seats were interesting, as there was now, what are these? I forgot the word. Buckets. Cars were now switching from benches to buckets now in the front, and it was even an option too. 3-seater bench or two-seat buckets for more than anything. But it was more de facto buckets than anything. And then, of course, entertainment. Cassettes were becoming big, so as soon as like cassette was around, use a cassette tape. Because I think cassette tapes were actually even a thing in the 70s. And they started to use them in cars and whatnot, other than 8-tracks. Rack and pinion is now becoming a standard car, switching to unibody. So especially hydraulic rack and pinion. So hydraulic rack and pinion is now like basically default. I think the only thing that didn't have hydraulic steering was probably like trucks, maybe a light car, etc., stuff like that. And ball steering was actually still used on big luxury landing yachts too, like a Lincoln Town Car or something like that. They still used hydraulic ball steering. But regular cars, rack and pinion, of course. ABS, when was that? Was put on luxury cars. Sometimes a standard starting mid-80s. Yes, like I said, it goes back again to like a town car. That used ABS in the mid-80s. That was really all the traction aids you got. Safety standard, optimize the weight. So keep that at 50. I don't know. That's really optional, I should say. Springs, standard was still de facto. Progressive still used on heavy duty and luxury options. Cadillac and Lincoln saw the use of air suspension. Yeah. You don't see the thing here because I don't think I have a thingy on it. So you'd have to like up it. Get air suspension? No. I think it was full independent. You have to get air suspension on this game. But yeah, well, shoot, actually, you don't even 4-way air suspension, because even though the town car had a rear solid axle like this, it still had air suspension, front and rear. But air suspension was an option on big luxury cars, though. Progressive heavy duties, no hydrodynamics still. Dampers, twin tubes, that was like de facto. Gas monotubes, I don't think were really used other than like performance and like probably just like an option. And adaptive, those were actually still an option. Adaptive was still being a thing because there was like a soft ride or a hard ride on something like a Ford Thunderbird. They um had a thing. Oh, and I forgot to mention one thing that I like about the 80s for every car is my research is also helped by Motor Week, which is probably like my favorite thing to research cars on because they go so in depth on everything. Like I wouldn't even know about half the cars here. Like research is just so easy now with Motor Week. So Motor Week is another thing if you want to kind of like research on your own. Watch a bunch of those 80s videos. And then back to suspension. Suspension was now tuned to be stiffer. Gone was the way of feeling like a land yacht, and in the way of the European feel, aka stiff springs and soft dampers. Sort of something like that. I'd say maybe a little bit more stiffer than that. It was like 1.4, 1.5 in the rear, and like 2.5 dampers. The dampers are good. Suspension is a little bit more. And of course, front sway bars were now standard on on all cars. Rear sway bars still aren't standardized because it's the way they work. Of just independent, fully independent. Sway bars work a lot better on fully independent, is why. And then, of course, ride height about the same 70s height, 1 to 2 inches above minimum height, which I have it like that. But yeah, 1 to 2 inches above. And that's actually it. Well, thank you for watching this all the way through if you did. And, of course, this guide will be in the description if you don't want to hear me yap on about everything. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Whatnot.